A millionaire had difficulty looking a woman in the eye due to a trauma, but an unexpected hiring of a new cook helped him overcome his fear. The millionaire discovers hidden truths. The New York skyline stretched before Maxwell Sterling like a kingdom of glass and steel, each skyscraper a testament to human ambition, to his ambition. From the 87th floor of Sterling Tower, the city seemed small, predictable, and entirely under his control. This was how Maxwell preferred everything in his life, calculated, measured, and within his grasp. The Beijing investors are waiting, Mr. Sterling, Charlotte, his executive assistant, said from the doorway. Her voice was practiced, professional, exactly why he'd hired her. No unnecessary emotions, no distractions. 5 minutes, Maxwell replied without turning from the window. His reflection stared back at him, silver-streaked dark hair, the tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, and eyes that financial journalists often described as steel-cold. At 52, Maxwell Sterling had built Sterling Enterprises into a global powerhouse spanning real estate, technology, and finance. Forbes listed him among America's 50 wealthiest individuals. The Wall Street Journal called him ruthlessly brilliant. Yet as he turned to face his executive boardroom, something hollow echoed within him, something all his billions couldn't fill. They're nervous about the Asian market fluctuations, Charlotte continued, handing him a tablet with the latest projections. They want reassurance that the Sterling legacy remains. Stable. Legacy. The word struck him like a physical blow. The boardroom fell silent as he entered. 12 faces turned toward him, his senior executives, legal team, and the potential investors from China, who controlled access to markets he needed for his next expansion. Maxwell took his position at the head of the table, the Manhattan skyline framing him through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Gentlemen," Maxwell began, his voice carrying the authority of someone unaccustomed to being questioned, "Sterling Enterprises has weathered 5 recessions, 2 global financial crises, and countless market disruptions. We don't simply survive uncertainties, we capitalize on them." The meeting proceeded with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Numbers were discussed, projections analyzed, contracts reviewed. Maxwell controlled the room as he controlled everything in his life, with calculated precision. The Chinese investors were visibly impressed, as most people were when directly exposed to his particular brand of confidence. 3 hours later, with handshakes exchanged and preliminary agreements secured, Maxwell returned to his private office. Charlotte followed with notes from the meeting. "The legal team needs your signature on the Westbrook development permits," she said, placing a leather portfolio on his desk. "And Mrs. Sterling called. She's confirmed the charity gala for Saturday." Maxwell nodded, his mind already elsewhere. "Tell the car service I'll be leaving early today." "Of course." Charlotte hesitated, then added, "Dr. Abrams's office also called. They want to reschedule your appointment for next week." A muscle tightened in Maxwell's jaw. "Cancel it, permanently." "Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Sterling specifically asked me to—" "I said cancel it." Charlotte nodded and retreated, closing the door silently behind her. Alone, Maxwell loosened his tie and poured himself 2 fingers of 30-year-old Macallan from the crystal decanter on his credenza. 15 years ago, when he'd married Vivian Bradford, daughter of Senator Bradford and heiress to old New England money, the merger had seemed perfect. She was elegant, well-connected, and understood the rules of their world. Their marriage wasn't about passion. It was about partnership, about building something enduring together, a legacy. His phone vibrated with a text from Vivian. "Don't forget dinner with the Kincaids tonight, 8 p.m. at Le Bernardin." Maxwell downed his scotch in one burning swallow. Another evening of meaningless conversation with people who wanted something from him. Vivian excelled at these social obligations. Her pedigree had trained her for exactly this kind of life. But lately, the performance felt increasingly hollow. When his private elevator delivered him to the underground parking garage, his driver, Thomas, was waiting with the Bentley. "The residence, sir." "No," Maxwell said, sliding into the back seat. "Take me to Dr. Sheffield's office." The drive uptown took 40 minutes in Manhattan traffic. Maxwell spent it reviewing acquisition reports on his tablet, but his mind kept drifting to the manila folder locked in his desk drawer, the one containing the latest results from fertility specialists. Sheffield Reproductive Medicine occupied the top floor of a discreet medical building on the Upper East Side. The waiting room was empty when Maxwell arrived. They always cleared the schedule when he came in. Dr. Victoria Sheffield greeted him personally, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Sterling, please come in." Her office was tastefully understated, with medical degrees from Harvard and Johns Hopkins displayed on one wall and a view of Central Park on the other. Maxwell took a seat, declining her offer of water or coffee. "I'll be direct," Dr. Sheffield said, clasping her hands on the desk. "We've reviewed all the tests, consulted with specialists at Mayo Clinic, and the conclusion remains unchanged. Mrs. Sterling's condition is significant. The scarring on her uterine wall suggests multiple procedures, possibly dating back to her early 20s. And there's nothing to be done." Maxwell's voice was flat, emotionless. "The likelihood of Mrs. Sterling ever carrying a pregnancy to term is less than 5%, even with the most advanced treatments available." Maxwell absorbed this information with the same composure he would analyze a failing investment. "And she's known this? For how long?" Dr. Sheffield hesitated. "Mr. Sterling, doctor-patient confidentiality prevents me from—" "I've paid your clinic 7 figures over the past 3 years, doctor. Don't talk to me about confidentiality when my wife has been lying to me." A tense silence filled the room. Finally, Dr. Sheffield spoke quietly. "Based on her medical records, Mrs. Sterling would have been aware of her condition before your marriage." The confirmation settled like ice in Maxwell's veins. For 15 years, Vivian had deceived him about the most fundamental aspect of their arrangement. She had known he wanted an heir. It had been discussed explicitly during their prenuptial negotiations. The Sterling name needed to continue. The empire needed a successor. "Thank you for your time, Doctor," Maxwell said, standing abruptly. "I won't be requiring your services any longer." That evening, Maxwell didn't go to dinner at Le Bernardin. Instead, he directed Thomas to drive him to his seldom-used pied-à-terre in Tribeca. The minimalist apartment felt appropriately sterile for his mood. He poured another scotch and stepped onto the balcony, watching the city lights blur through the glass barrier. His phone rang repeatedly. Vivian, then Charlotte, then his chief legal counsel, James Harrington. He ignored them all. For the first time in decades, Maxwell Sterling was not in control, and the sensation was intolerable. By midnight, his mind had cleared into cold, crystalline focus. He called James. "I need the Patterson file," he said when James answered, his voice groggy with sleep. "Maxwell? It's after midnight. What file?" "The contingency plans we prepared. When I was considering the succession structure for Sterling Enterprises." "You mean the surrogate protocols?" James sounded fully awake now. "Maxwell, are you sure that's—" "Have it on my desk by 9 tomorrow. And James, prepare divorce papers. Full confidentiality. I want Vivian's deception documented as breach of contract." The line went silent for a moment. "This is a significant step, Maxwell. Perhaps you should—" 9 o'clock, James. Maxwell ended the call and stared out at the glittering city below. Throughout his life, he had eliminated obstacles with ruthless efficiency. Vivian's betrayal was simply another problem to solve, another variable to control. He would have his heir, he would have his legacy, and this time, he would leave nothing to chance. As dawn broke over the Manhattan skyline, Maxwell Sterling made a decision that would irrevocably change the course of his carefully controlled life, though not in any way he could possibly predict. 6 months after filing for divorce, Maxwell Sterling stood in his newly redesigned office at Sterling Tower. The wall that once displayed family photos, carefully curated by Vivian for visiting journalists, now showcased only the expanding Sterling corporate portfolio. The divorce had been swift, clinical, and brutally expensive, but Maxwell considered it an investment in his future. Vivian had walked away with nearly $300 million and the Southampton estate, bound by ironclad confidentiality agreements that would ensure her silence. "The candidates are ready for review, Mr. Sterling." said Rebecca Winters, the specialist he'd hired specifically for this project. Her background in both high-end executive recruitment and medical ethics made her uniquely qualified to handle what Maxwell had termed the Legacy Initiative. "How many made it through the final screening?" Maxwell asked, taking the secure tablet she offered. "5," Rebecca replied. "All meet your specific criteria: under 30, excellent health profiles, high intelligence metrics, no family history of genetic disorders, and no previous pregnancies." Maxwell nodded approvingly. "And the psychological evaluations?" "Comprehensive. 3-phase assessments, background checks going back to childhood. We've eliminated anyone with addiction issues, mental health concerns, or unstable family dynamics." Rebecca hesitated before adding, "Though I must say your requirement for candidates with limited social connections and financial hardship does narrow the field considerably." "That's precisely the point," Maxwell replied coolly. "I need someone with sufficient motivation to honor the contract terms without external complications." Rebecca's expression remained neutral, though Maxwell detected a flicker of discomfort. He didn't care. She was being paid 7 figures to execute this project with absolute discretion, not to offer moral commentary. "Candidate 27 seems most promising," Rebecca said, gesturing to the tablet. 24 years old, graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern, currently working as a research assistant while applying to medical schools. Her academic references are exceptional. Maxwell flicked through the profile with practiced efficiency. Family situation: mother with advanced multiple sclerosis, significant medical debt. No father in the picture since childhood. She's the sole caregiver and financial support. "Perfect," Maxwell murmured. He continued reviewing the profiles, asking pointed questions about each candidate's background, motivations, and psychological assessments. After an hour of deliberation, he handed the tablet back to Rebecca. "Arrange a meeting with candidate 27, Emma Thorne. For the initial interview, or no intermediaries, I'll conduct this meeting personally." Rebecca looked surprised but quickly recovered. "I'll arrange it immediately. How should I present the opportunity to her?" "Tell her only that a private benefactor is considering funding her medical school education and her mother's care in exchange for a year-long private employment contract. No details beyond that." 3 days later, Maxwell sat in the private dining room at 11 Madison Park, watching through the one-way glass as Emma Thorne was escorted to a table in the main restaurant. The young woman was striking in a way her photographs hadn't fully captured, tall and slender, with auburn hair tied back in a simple knot, wearing a modest navy dress that suggested she'd made an effort without having much to work with. Maxwell observed as she politely declined wine from the sommelier, requesting water instead. She sat straight-backed but betrayed her nervousness by repeatedly adjusting the simple silver watch on her wrist. She was out of her element in one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, but handling it with surprising composure. After 20 minutes of observation, Maxwell nodded to his security chief, who relayed the message to the maitre d'. Emma was escorted to the private dining room, her expression shifting from nervous anticipation to guarded surprise when she saw Maxwell Sterling waiting for her. "Miss Thorne," Maxwell said, standing as she entered, "thank you for coming." "Mr. Sterling," she replied, recognition clear in her voice. "I didn't expect to be meeting someone like you. Please sit." He gestured to the chair across from him. "I assume you have questions." Emma sat carefully, her green eyes studying him with intelligent wariness. "Quite a few, actually. Your representative was remarkably vague about what this opportunity entails, beyond mentioning medical school funding and assistance with my mother's care. Directness, good." Maxwell appreciated efficiency. "I'll be equally direct. I'm looking for a surrogate to carry my child, Ms. Thorne, an heir to the Sterling name and fortune." Emma's expression didn't change, though her fingers tightened, almost imperceptibly around her water glass. "A surrogate," she repeated carefully, "and you're approaching me because you've been thoroughly vetted. Your genetic profile, intelligence, physical health, and personal circumstances make you an ideal candidate. My personal circumstances, Emma echoed, a hint of steel entering her voice. You mean my financial desperation and limited social connections? Maxwell didn't bother denying it. I need someone who will honor a contract without complications. Your mother's medical needs provide sufficient motivation, and your limited family ties mean fewer potential interferences. Emma's gaze didn't waver. So this is purely transactional. You're shopping for convenient genetics and a compliant incubator. I'm offering a mutually beneficial arrangement, Maxwell corrected, unmoved by her characterization. In exchange for carrying my child and maintaining absolute confidentiality, I will provide full funding for your medical school education at any institution that accepts you, comprehensive care for your mother at the country's top MS treatment, facility and financial compensation of $2 million upon delivery of a healthy child. He watched as Emma processed the information, her analytical mind visibly working through implications and possibilities. And after the birth, you would relinquish all parental rights. The child would be exclusively mine, and my involvement would be limited to the pregnancy. You would live in a private residence I provide, receive the best prenatal care available, and follow a carefully designed health regimen. After delivery and a reasonable recovery period, our arrangement would conclude. Emma was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she asked, "Why me? Someone with your resources could surely find a surrogate through conventional channels. Why this elaborate vetting process?" It was a perceptive question. Maxwell considered how much to reveal and decided a partial truth would serve best. I recently ended my marriage after discovering my wife had concealed her inability to have children throughout our 15-year relationship. I have no interest in further deceptions or complications. This way everything is governed by clear contractual terms. Emma nodded slowly, absorbing this. And artificial insemination would be the method? Yes. Everything would be handled through medical professionals. I see. She took a sip of water, then set the glass down deliberately. And if I decline? Then you'll leave with a generous consultation fee for your time today, and we'll never speak again. Maxwell removed an envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table. $10,000 regardless of your decision. Emma didn't touch the envelope. When would you need my answer? I appreciate that this requires consideration. You have 1 week. Maxwell slid a business card across the table. This has a secure contact number. My legal team will arrange the details if you accept. Emma finally took both the envelope and the card, tucking them into her purse. One last question, Mr. Sterling. Why do you want a child? From everything I've read about you, building your empire has been your singular focus. Why complicate that now? The question caught Maxwell off guard, not because he hadn't considered it, but because few people would dare ask him something so personal. For a brief moment, the practiced corporate mask slipped. Everything I've built will outlast me, Miss Thorne, but without someone to continue what I've started, it's just buildings and bank accounts. He paused, then added with unexpected rawness, I'm not interested in being a footnote in someone else's acquisition story. Something shifted. In Emma's expression, not quite sympathy, but a flash of recognition. She stood, smoothing her dress. I'll give you my answer within the week, Mr. Sterling. Maxwell watched her leave, struck by the peculiar sensation that despite orchestrating this entire scenario, something had occurred that he hadn't fully controlled. 6 days later, Maxwell was reviewing acquisition papers in his Tribeca apartment when his secure phone rang. Emma Thorne's name appeared on the screen. Miss Thorne, he answered, have you reached a decision? I have conditions, Emma said without preamble. Her voice was clear, determined. The contract is non-negotiable, Maxwell replied automatically. Then I decline. Her response was immediate and unflinching. Goodbye, Mr. Sterling. Wait. The word escaped before he could consider it. Maxwell Sterling didn't chase after people, they came to him. Yet something about her readiness to walk away caught him off guard. What conditions? First, my mother's care begins immediately upon signing, not after delivery. Second, I want a separate trust established for her that continues regardless of the pregnancy outcome. Third, I remain enrolled in my research position remotely during the pregnancy. My mind isn't part of this transaction. Maxwell found himself unexpectedly impressed by her clarity. Is that all? No, I want quarterly deposits toward my medical school fund during the pregnancy, not a lump sum after. And finally, I want your personal guarantee that you'll be an involved parent. I won't create a child who becomes a trophy or an afterthought. The last condition was so unexpected that Maxwell actually laughed. You're in no position to evaluate my parenting potential, Ms. Thorne. Maybe not, she conceded. But I can decide whether to participate in creating a child who might suffer from neglect. That's my final condition, Mr. Sterling. I need to know this child will be wanted, not just acquired. The line went silent as Maxwell considered her audacity. Any other candidate would be immediately dismissed for such presumption. Yet her conditions were remarkably revealing, focused not on extracting more money for herself, but on security for her mother and welfare for the unborn child. It was unexpected. I'll have the adjusted contract sent to you tomorrow, he said finally. But understand this, Miss Thorne. Once signed, you will follow every stipulation to the letter. As will you, Mr. Sterling, she replied evenly. I'll expect the paperwork tomorrow. 3 weeks later, in the sterile environment of an exclusive fertility clinic on the Upper East Side, Emma Thorne signed the final contract while Maxwell's attorneys observed. 57 pages of legal language that transformed a human life into a business transaction. Neither of them could have possibly anticipated how profoundly that contract would change them both. The Westchester estate sat on 12 manicured acres, its limestone facade and slate roof giving it the dignified appearance of old money rather than Maxwell's new wealth. He had purchased it through a shell corporation 6 years earlier as an investment property, never intending to use it himself. Now it served as the perfect secluded location for his arrangement with Emma Thorne. Dr. Catherine Chen, the fertility specialist Maxwell had personally selected, delivered the news with clinical precision. Congratulations, Mr. Sterling. The procedure was successful. Ms. Thorne is approximately 8 weeks pregnant. Maxwell nodded, receiving the news in his typical measured fashion. And everything is proceeding normally? Perfectly. Though I must note that Ms. Thorne experienced significant morning sickness last week. It's within normal parameters, but I've adjusted her medication accordingly. Ensure she has everything she needs, Maxwell replied. I want daily reports on her condition. He had expected to feel more upon confirmation, some sense of victory or accomplishment. Instead, he felt a strange hollowness, followed by an unfamiliar sensation of responsibility that caught him off guard. In the 3 months since Emma had moved into the Westchester house, their interaction had been minimal by design. Maxwell provided everything required, a full staff including a chef preparing meals to Dr. Chen's exact nutritional specifications, a security team ensuring privacy, and a driver available for any approved outings. The contract permitted Emma to have her research materials delivered and to conduct her work remotely, as she had requested. Maxwell himself visited only for scheduled monthly updates from Dr. Chen. He had deliberately maintained his distance, treating the arrangement as he would any business venture, with detached oversight and delegated management. Today, however, as he prepared to leave following Dr. Chen's report, Emma appeared in the doorway of the estate's sunroom. Her auburn hair was pulled back in its usual practical style, but her face had a new softness to it, a subtle glow that gave him pause. Mr. Sterling, she said, do you have a moment? Maxwell checked his watch, a habit so ingrained he didn't realize he was doing it. Briefly, is there an issue with the arrangements? No, everything is fine. She stepped into the room, moving with the careful awareness of someone adjusting to changes in their body. I just thought, perhaps you'd like to see this. She extended her hand, holding a small black and white image. The ultrasound. Maxwell hesitated before taking it. The image was grainy, indistinct to his untrained eye, yet undeniably real. His child, his heir, tangible evidence of his legacy taking form. Dr. Chen says everything looks perfect, Emma offered into his silence. Strong heartbeat, normal development. Maxwell stared at the image, unexpectedly moved by something so small and undefined. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice unexpectedly hoarse. He cleared his throat. "For showing me this." Emma studied him with those perceptive green eyes that seemed to see more than he intended to reveal. "You're welcome to attend the next appointment. Dr. Chen will be doing another scan at 12 weeks. The invitation caught him off guard. Nothing in their contract required his presence at medical appointments. That's why he had hired Dr. Chen. "I have a busy schedule," he replied automatically. "Of course." Emma nodded, her expression neutral. "Just an offer." As she turned to leave, Maxwell found himself asking, "How are you feeling?" Emma paused, seemingly as surprised by the question as he was by asking it. "Better this week. The morning sickness is finally easing. Your chef has been wonderful about finding foods I can tolerate." Maxwell nodded. "Good. If you need anything, the staff has instructions to accommodate reasonable requests." "I know." A small smile touched her lips. "Though your definition of reasonable is interesting. I asked for a book yesterday and somehow ended up with an entire library being delivered." "Specificity matters in any request," Maxwell replied, though he felt an unexpected urge to return her smile. "If you'd specified a particular book, you would have received just that." "I'll remember that." Her smile widened slightly. "Though I have to admit, the library was a pleasant surprise. I've always wanted access to first editions of Austen and Dickens." Maxwell found himself oddly pleased by her appreciation of the books. Most women in his experience would have preferred jewelry or designer clothing, not that he'd authorized such purchases for Emma, but her values seemed refreshingly different. "The Fitzgerald collection was my particular indulgence," he said, surprising himself with the personal admission. "The Great Gatsby First Edition is quite valuable." "I noticed," Emma replied. "Though I preferred Tender is the Night, there's something compelling about watching someone's carefully constructed world unravel." The observation hung between them, uncomfortably perceptive. Maxwell checked his watch again. "I should go. The board meeting—" "Of course. Thank you for the library, Mr. Sterling." Maxwell nodded and left, the ultrasound image still in his hand. He didn't realize he'd kept it until he was halfway back to Manhattan. 2 weeks later, against all logical planning, Maxwell found himself sitting beside Emma in Dr. Chen's examination room as she reclined on the medical chair. He told himself, it was simple due diligence, monitoring an important investment, but something about watching the real-time ultrasound image form on the screen made such cold calculations impossible. "There's your baby," Dr. Chen said, pointing to the monitor, "growing perfectly on schedule." The sound of the heartbeat filled the room, rapid, insistent, alive. Maxwell found himself transfixed by the strong, steady rhythm. "Would you like to know the sex?" Dr. Chen asked. "It's early, but I can tell with reasonable certainty." Maxwell looked at Emma, unexpectedly uncertain. Their contract didn't specify anything about this moment. "It's your decision," Emma said quietly. "Your child." Something about her phrasing bothered him. "Our decision," he corrected, then immediately wondered why he'd said it. "If you have a preference about knowing." Emma seemed surprised by his deference. "I'd like to know if you don't mind." Maxwell nodded to Dr. Chen, who smiled. "Congratulations. You're having a boy. A son." The word resonated through Maxwell with unexpected force. Not just an heir now, but a son. For a man who prided himself on emotional control, the surge of feeling was disorienting. Later, as they rode back to the Westchester house in his Bentley, an unusual silence hung between them. Emma gazed out the window at the autumn leaves, one hand resting lightly on her still flat stomach in an unconscious gesture. "Have you thought about names?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Maxwell hadn't. Naming implied an emotional connection he hadn't anticipated needing to form so soon. "Not specifically," he admitted. "The Sterling name has certain traditional options, Maxwell is actually my middle name. First name is William, after my grandfather. William Sterling. Emma tested the name aloud. It has a distinguished sound. My grandfather built the initial Sterling real estate portfolio during the post-war boom. Maxwell found himself explaining. Started with nothing and created the foundation for everything I've expanded. You admired him, Emma observed. He understood what mattered, building something enduring. Maxwell rarely discussed his family background. Why was he sharing this now? And your father? Maxwell's expression hardened. William Sterling II. He nearly destroyed everything my grandfather built. Poor investments, worse personal choices. I had to rebuild much of it after he ran the company into the ground. Emma studied him with that unsettling perceptiveness. So you're actually the one who built the empire, not just expanded it. I suppose that's accurate. No one had ever framed it quite that way before. Most people assumed Maxwell had simply been handed his wealth. That's why this matters so much to you, Emma said softly. It's not just about continuing the Sterling name. It's about preserving what you personally created. The insight was uncomfortably accurate. Maxwell changed the subject. Dr. Chen mentioned you've been walking the grounds daily. Is the security presence not too intrusive? Emma accepted the shift gracefully. They keep a respectful distance. And the gardens are beautiful. Your groundskeeper mentioned they're modeled after some estate in the Cotswolds. Hidcote Manor. I saw it years ago during a business trip to England. The room arrangements appealed to me. The outdoor rooms concept, Emma nodded. I noticed that, how each garden section feels like an intimate space despite being outdoors. It's clever design. Maxwell glanced at her with new interest. You're familiar with landscape architecture? My undergraduate minor before pre-med. I've always been fascinated by design spaces, how they influence human emotion and behavior. She smiled slightly. Though botany helps with biochemistry too. An unusual combination. I contain multitudes, she quipped, then added more seriously. Most people do if you look beyond the surface. The observation lingered as they pulled through the estate gates. Maxwell found himself reluctant to end their conversation, which was entirely unprecedented. He never prolonged social interactions unnecessarily. Would you? Emma began at the same moment Maxwell said, Perhaps we... They both stopped. Emma gestured for him to continue. Maxwell wasn't entirely sure what he had been about to suggest. Perhaps we should establish a more regular update schedule, weekly rather than monthly. For medical updates, Emma asked, her expression unreadable. Among other considerations, preparations for the child, practical arrangements. That seems sensible, Emma agreed, though something in her tone suggested she had been about to suggest something entirely different. As she exited the car, Maxwell found himself watching her walk toward the house, struck by the peculiar sensation that something was shifting beneath the carefully structured arrangement they had created, something neither of them had anticipated in their meticulously drafted contract. 2 days later, Maxwell was in his office reviewing quarterly projections when his private line rang. Only 5 people had that number, and it was unusual for any of them to use it during business hours. Sterling, he answered. Mr. Sterling, this is Sarah Miller, head of security at the Westchester property. Her voice was tense, professional. There's been an incident. Maxwell's hand tightened on the phone. What kind of incident? Is Ms. Thorne? She's unharmed, sir, but approximately 20 minutes ago, a reporter and photographer from the New York Standard managed to breach the perimeter. They were apprehended by security before reaching the main house, but they claimed to have information about your surrogate arrangement and were attempting to get photographs of Ms. Thorne. Cold anger washed through Maxwell. How did they get this information? Where are they now? They've been removed from the property. We confiscated their equipment, but they were quite specific in their claims, sir. They mentioned a contract, a payment schedule, and Ms. Thorne by name. Someone had leaked information, someone with access to the confidential arrangements. The betrayal was intolerable. Lock down the property. No one enters or leaves without my direct authorization. I'm on my way. Maxwell ended the call and immediately dialed James Harrington, his chief counsel. We have a breach, he said without preamble. "The Standard knows about Thorne. Find the leak and shut it down. I want every available legal option prepared by the time I reach Westchester." James didn't waste time with questions. "On it. Do you want me to meet you there?" "No. Handle this from the legal side. I'll deal with the immediate situation." The drive to Westchester took 40 minutes with his security detail clearing traffic ahead of him. By the time Maxwell arrived, his cold fury had crystallized into focused determination. Someone would pay dearly for this breach. Emma was in the library when he entered, sitting calmly in one of the leather armchairs with a book open in her lap. She looked up as he strode in, her expression composed, but her eyes wary. "Are you all right?" he demanded without greeting. "I'm fine," she replied evenly, though having armed guards suddenly appear while I was walking in the garden was rather startling. "You weren't supposed to be outside alone," Maxwell snapped, his concern manifesting as anger. "I wasn't aware. I was under house arrest," Emma countered, closing her book. "The contract specifies I follow medical guidelines, not that I'm confined indoors. The contract also guarantees your security, which requires certain protocols, which I've followed. Your security detail has always maintained visual contact." Emma's calm was infuriating in the face of his tension. "What happened exactly?" "No one will tell me anything except that there's been a security incident." Maxwell paced the length of the library. "Someone leaked information about our arrangement to the press. Reporters breached the perimeter trying to get photographs of you." Emma paled slightly. "How much do they know?" "Enough to be dangerous. They had your name, details about the contract." Maxwell stopped pacing and faced her directly. "Did you tell anyone, contact anyone unauthorized?" The accusation hung in the air between them. Emma's expression shifted from concern to indignation. "No," she said firmly. "I've honored every part of our agreement, including confidentiality. I haven't even told my mother the full truth. She believes I'm participating in a medical research residency with a living stipend." Maxwell studied her face, looking for any sign of deception. He found none. "Then we have a serious problem. Someone with inside access has betrayed us both." "What happens now?" Emma asked, one hand moving unconsciously to rest on her stomach, a protective gesture that Maxwell didn't miss. "Now," Maxwell said grimly, "we prepare for war." The headline broke on a Tuesday morning. "Baby for sale, Sterling's secret surrogate scandal." By noon, every major news outlet had picked up the story. The New York Standard had published excerpts from what appeared to be the actual contract between Maxwell Sterling and Emma Thorne, complete with payment schedules and clinical details that could only have come from someone with direct access to the confidential documents. Maxwell sat in his office at Sterling Tower, surrounded by his crisis management team. James Harrington, his chief counsel, Diana Lawrence, head of public relations, and Mitchell Graves, his recently hired head of security. "The damage control options are limited," Diana said, her voice tense but professional. "The Standard is running with a billionaire buys baby angle, painting Ms. Thorne as a vulnerable young woman exploited by a powerful man. The public reaction is not favorable." "I don't care about public opinion," Maxwell replied coldly. "I care about who leaked this information and how we shut them down." James slid a tablet across the conference table. "We've filed for an emergency injunction against further publication of the contract details, citing privacy violations and breach of confidentiality. But the information is already circulating. Social media is problematic." Maxwell scanned the tablet, screenshots from Twitter and Instagram where Chask Sterling baby buyer was trending nationwide. Comment sections on news sites overflowed with outrage, much of it directed at him personally. Another billionaire who thinks he can buy anything, including people. Does that poor woman wonder how voluntary this arrangement really was? Sterling treats having a child like acquiring another company. Disgusting. Maxwell set the tablet down, his expression unreadable. "What's the status on identifying the leak?" Mitchell Graves cleared his throat. "We've narrowed it down to 3 possibilities. Someone at the fertility clinic, though they all signed extensive NDAs. Someone from the legal team that drafted the contracts, or..." He hesitated. Or what? Maxwell's voice was dangerously quiet. Or someone closer to you, sir. Someone with personal motivation. Vivian. Maxwell didn't phrase it as a question. His ex-wife had maintained a dignified public silence since their divorce, but he knew her well enough to recognize her capacity for calculated revenge. The timing was suspect, just as Sterling Enterprises was finalizing a major acquisition that would substantially increase the company's value. "We have no direct evidence," James cautioned, "but she would have had knowledge of your intentions regarding an heir. And the divorce settlement, while generous, was considerably less than she might have received had certain details about her medical deception become public." "Find proof," Maxwell ordered. "And where is Ms. Thorne now?" "Secure at the Connecticut property," Mitchell replied. "We moved her last night as a precaution. Full security detail in place, no digital footprint." Maxwell nodded. The Connecticut property was even more isolated than the Westchester estate, a modernist structure set on 50 acres of heavily wooded land with state-of-the-art security systems. "The board is requesting an emergency meeting," Diana said quietly. "Goldman and Richards have already called expressing concerns about company stability. Several major shareholders are threatening to sell their positions." Maxwell's jaw tightened. This was more than a personal scandal. It was becoming a direct threat to everything he'd built. Sterling Enterprises stock had dropped 8% since the market opened, and if major institutional investors lost confidence, the damage could be catastrophic. "Schedule the board meeting for tomorrow morning. I'll handle them personally," Maxwell said. "In the meantime, leak a counter-narrative. Focus on my ex-wife's medical deception during our marriage. Make it clear this was about securing a legacy. That was wrongfully denied, not," he gestured dismissively at the tablet, "buying a baby." Diana looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Sterling, using your ex-wife's medical condition as a PR strategy could backfire significantly. It might generate sympathy for her rather than you, especially given the current sentiment." "Then find another angle," Maxwell snapped. "That's what I pay you for." The meeting continued for another hour. Strategy documents were prepared, and legal responses drafted. Throughout it all, Maxwell maintained his characteristic control, issuing directives with cool precision. Only after everyone had departed did he allow himself a moment of genuine reaction. Alone in his office, Maxwell poured himself a scotch and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. The city stretched before him, as it always had, a kingdom he had conquered through sheer determination and strategic brilliance. Yet now, for the first time in decades, he felt something slipping from his grasp. His phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk, E. Emma." He'd deliberately avoided direct contact since moving her to the Connecticut house, delegating all communication through security personnel. What could she possibly want to discuss that couldn't be handled through appropriate channels? "Against his better judgment," Maxwell replied, "not secure." The response came immediately. "Your secure line." 10 minutes. 10 minutes later, his private line rang. "This is ill-advised," Maxwell said by way of greeting. "Probably," Emma agreed, her voice calm despite the circumstances. "But necessary. I've seen the news coverage. The situation is being managed." "Is it?" Emma's tone was skeptical. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like it's managing you." Maxwell was surprised by her directness. "The media will find another scandal soon enough. Corporate security breaches are handled every day. This isn't just a corporate issue, Mr. Sterling. This is about a child, your son, my body, our lives being dissected for public entertainment." There was steel beneath her words. "And your management strategy is apparently to hide me away like a shameful secret while your PR team spins narratives. The Connecticut property is for your protection," Maxwell said stiffly. "Is it? Because it feels a lot like you're distancing yourself from me, from us, to minimize damage to your precious company." The accusation hit with unexpected force. "What exactly do you expect me to do, Ms. Thorne? The contract—" "Stop talking about the damned contract!" Emma's composure finally cracked. This is no longer about legal agreements and confidentiality clauses. This is about real lives. Your son will eventually read these stories. He'll form opinions about his origins based on how we handle this moment. Her words landed like physical blows. Maxwell hadn't considered the long-term implications for the child himself, how this public narrative might shape his son's understanding of his own existence. "What do you suggest?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "Face. Say it directly," Emma said without hesitation. "Not through PR teams or carefully crafted statements. You, personally, humanize this situation before they dehumanize all of us. Public vulnerability is not my area of expertise." "Then find a new expertise," Emma replied firmly, "because right now the world is painting you as a cold, calculating monster who purchased a woman's body to satisfy his ego. Is that the story you want your son to find when he's old enough to search his father's name?" The question hung between them, unanswerable. "I have to go," Maxwell said finally. "Security protocols require brief communications only." "Maxwell," Emma said, using his first name for the first time, "whatever you decide to do, remember that your son will someday judge your choices. Make them ones he can respect." The line went dead, leaving Maxwell staring at the phone, unsettled by her words and even more by the strange weight they carried. The board meeting the next morning was as contentious as expected. Maxwell entered the Sterling Enterprises boardroom to find 11 grim-faced directors awaiting him, along with representatives from the company's major institutional investors. "This is an unprecedented situation, Maxwell," said Howard Richards, the lead independent director and Maxwell's longest-standing ally on the board. "The markets are reacting, partners are nervous, and the public narrative is problematic." "The company's fundamentals remain strong," Maxwell replied, taking his seat at the head of the table. "This is a personal matter being sensationalized by the media. It will pass." Richard Goldman, representing a major pension fund that held nearly 8% of Sterling Enterprises stock, leaned forward. "With respect, Mr. Sterling, when you are the brand, there is no separation between personal and corporate. Your reputation directly impacts shareholder value, and right now, that reputation is taking a significant hit." For the next 2 hours, Maxwell defended his position, while the board and investors expressed increasing concern about the company's stability under his leadership. The subtext became increasingly clear. Either Maxwell needed to distance himself from the company during this crisis, or the board would consider more drastic measures. "Perhaps a temporary leave of absence would be appropriate," Howard suggested delicately, "just until this situation stabilizes." Maxwell's expression hardened. "This company bears my name. I built it from near ruin after my father's mismanagement. I'm not stepping aside because of media sensationalism about my private life." "We're not asking," Goldman replied coldly. "We're telling you what needs to happen to preserve shareholder value. Either you temporarily step back, or we'll call for a vote of no confidence at the next shareholder meeting." The threat was clear. While Maxwell remained the largest individual shareholder, the combined institutional investors could potentially force him out if they united against him. "You have 24 hours to consider your position," Howard said, a note of genuine regret in his voice. "We need your decision by this time tomorrow." Maxwell left the boardroom without another word, a cold fury building inside him. In his office, he found James waiting with another development. "We've confirmed the leak," James said without preamble. "It wasn't Vivian." Maxwell stopped short. "Who then?" "Dr. Victoria Sheffield." The name hit Maxwell like a physical blow. The fertility specialist who had confirmed Vivian's condition, who had told him his wife had known about her infertility before their marriage. "Explain," Maxwell demanded. James handed him a file. "She was the connecting thread we missed. She treated both Vivian and oversaw the early stages of Ms. Thorne's case before you brought in Dr. Chen. When we traced the document trail, we found Sheffield accessed the digital copies of the surrogate contract using Vivian's patient portal credentials. Why would she do this?" Maxwell's mind raced through possibilities. Financial motivation? Not exactly. James hesitated. We found a series of payments from Sheffield's private account to a medical research facility in Switzerland. The same facility where Vivian received treatment 20 years ago, before your marriage. What kind of treatment? That's where it gets complicated. The records are heavily protected, but our investigators found references to experimental procedures involving, James paused, clearly uncomfortable, directed tissue scarring, intentional uterine damage. Maxwell stared at him, the implications slowly crystallizing. Are you suggesting Vivian's condition was deliberately induced? That Sheffield was involved in making her infertile? The evidence suggests more than involvement. Sheffield appears to have performed the procedure personally, then later covered it up by presenting it to you as a pre-existing condition. The revelation was staggering. But why? What possible motivation? Money, most likely. The Swiss clinic is connected to a medical technology company that's been competing with Sterling Medical Solutions for government contracts. Your marriage to Vivian, with her political connections through her father, positioned Sterling Enterprises to secure those contracts. If you'd had children together, your connection to the Bradford political dynasty would have been permanent. They sabotaged my marriage to undermine my business, Maxwell said slowly, the full scope of the betrayal becoming clear. And Sheffield continued monitoring both of us afterward, which is how she learned about the surrogate arrangement. It appears so. She likely leaked the contract to generate enough public scandal to damage both your personal reputation and the company's standing before the government contract renewals next quarter. Maxwell sat heavily in his chair, the weight of this conspiracy momentarily overwhelming even his formidable self-control. For over 15 years, he had believed Vivian had deliberately deceived him about her ability to have children, when in reality, she had been an unwitting victim of corporate sabotage aimed at him. Where is Sheffield now? Gone. Left the country 3 days ago. Switzerland, presumably. And Vivian? Unaware, as far as we can tell. The damage was done before your marriage, likely when she was studying in Europe during her early 20s. The procedure was probably disguised as routine treatment for another condition. Maxwell was silent for a long moment, processing this revelation. Then, with sudden decision, he stood. Contact Vivian. Tell her I need to speak with her personally. It's urgent. James looked surprised. Are you sure that's wise, given the current media situation? This goes beyond media management now. Maxwell's voice was tight with controlled emotion. This is about justice, for both of us. After James left, Maxwell stood at his office window, watching the city below as evening descended. The lights of Manhattan blinked on one by one like stars emerging in an urban sky. His phone vibrated with another text from Emma. Have you decided what story you want to tell? For the first time in his meticulously controlled life, Maxwell Sterling found himself without a strategic plan. The foundations upon which he'd built his understanding of the past 15 years had been violently uprooted, leaving him adrift in uncertainty. His empire was threatening to crumble around him. The board was on the verge of forcing him out. His reputation was being systematically dismantled in the public eye. And somewhere in Connecticut, the mother of his child was asking him what story he wanted to tell his son. As night fell over the city, Maxwell made a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. He picked up his phone and began to type. Mr. Sterling, we're ready for you. Maxwell nodded to the producer, straightening his tie as a makeup artist made final adjustments to his appearance. In the 30 years he'd spent building his empire, he had given countless interviews, always carefully orchestrated, always on his terms, always with precise talking points prepared by his communications team. This was different. The studio lights of the CBS morning show felt uncomfortably hot as he took his seat opposite Diane Foster, one of the network's most respected journalists, known for her unflinching interview style. This wasn't Maxwell's preferred forum. He had specifically chosen it because it wasn't. We're live in 3, 2... The producer pointed silently, and the red light on the camera illuminated. Good morning, I'm Diane Foster. Today we have an exclusive interview with Maxwell Sterling, CEO of Sterling Enterprises, who has been at the center of a controversy that has dominated headlines for the past week. Mr. Sterling, thank you for joining us. Thank you for having me, Diane. Let's address this directly. Reports claim you entered into a contract with a young woman, Emma Thorne, to bear your child in exchange for financial compensation. Is this accurate? Maxwell met her gaze steadily. Yes, I did enter into a legal surrogacy arrangement with Ms. Thorne. Critics have characterized this as buying a baby, suggesting the financial disparity between you and Ms. Thorne created an exploitative dynamic. How do you respond? 3 days earlier, Maxwell would have deflected with corporate precision, redirecting the narrative through calculated talking points. Now he did something entirely unexpected. He told the truth. I've spent my life believing that control equals strength, he said quietly. When my marriage ended, I approached having a child the same way I've approached everything else, as a transaction to be managed, an outcome to be secured. I now recognize that was profoundly misguided. Diane looked momentarily taken aback by his candor. Are you saying you regret the arrangement? I regret treating the creation of a life, my son's life, as a business venture. I regret not recognizing sooner that some things can't and shouldn't be controlled through contracts and financial leverage. Maxwell paused, then added, But I don't regret the opportunity to become a father, which is what this has always been about. You mentioned your marriage. Your ex-wife, Vivian Sterling, has remained silent throughout this controversy. Was your divorce related to this surrogacy plan? My divorce was the result of a profound misunderstanding that lasted 15 years, Maxwell said carefully. I recently discovered that both Vivian and I were victims of a deliberate deception orchestrated by people who sought to undermine both our marriage and my company. Interest sharpened in Diane's eyes. That's a serious allegation. Can you elaborate? Evidence has emerged that Vivian was subjected to an unauthorized medical procedure early in her life that rendered her unable to have children, a fact neither of us knew when we married. The physician who later discovered and revealed this condition to me was, in fact, involved in causing it, as part of a coordinated effort to prevent a permanent alliance between my company and my former wife's politically connected family. Murmurs could be heard among the off-camera production staff. This revelation was clearly unexpected. Are you suggesting corporate sabotage that extended to medical interference with your ex-wife's body? Diane asked, her professional composure momentarily slipping. The evidence points to exactly that. The authorities have been provided with all relevant information. Maxwell's voice was steady but tight with controlled anger. This conspiracy has caused immeasurable harm to both Vivian and myself. Our marriage ended because I believed she had deliberately concealed her condition from me. In reality, she was as much a victim as I was. Has Ms. Sterling been made aware of these findings? Yes. We've spoken at length in recent days. She's pursuing her own legal recourse against the responsible parties. Diane nodded, then shifted focus. Let's return to Ms. Thorne, your surrogate. Where is she now and how has this public exposure affected her? Emma is currently in a secure location for her privacy and safety. The public attention has been challenging. Maxwell hesitated, then added, but she's an extraordinary person, far stronger and more perceptive than I initially gave her credit for. Your tone suggests a relationship beyond the contractual arrangement. Maxwell was silent for a moment, considering his response. I entered into this arrangement believing I could maintain emotional distance, that this was simply about securing an heir for my legacy. I was wrong. Are you saying you've developed feelings for Ms. Thorne? I'm saying that Emma helped me understand what truly matters. Maxwell looked directly into the camera. For most of my life, I've equated legacy with wealth, with buildings that bear my name, with corporate acquisitions. I measured success by control and power. Emma showed me there are things far more valuable that can't be bought or controlled, such as authenticity, integrity, the courage to be vulnerable. Maxwell smiled slightly. All qualities I've dismissed as irrelevant to success, yet Emma embodies them effortlessly. That's quite a transformation in perspective, Mr. Sterling. Your reputation has been built on ruthless business tactics and emotional detachment. Are you asking the public to believe you've had a complete change of heart? I'm not asking the public to believe anything, Maxwell replied. I'm simply telling the truth, perhaps for the first time in a very public way. People will form their own judgments. The Sterling Enterprises Board has reportedly asked you to step down temporarily during this controversy. Will you comply? I've submitted my resignation as CEO, effective immediately. The statement sent a visible ripple of shock through the studio. That's breaking news, Diane said, leaning forward. Sterling Enterprises is your life's work. Are you saying you're walking away entirely? I'm saying priorities change. Maxwell's expression was resolute. The company will continue under capable leadership. I've appointed Howard Richards as interim CEO while the board conducts a formal search process. And what will you do? Focus on what matters most. Preparing to be a father to my son, supporting Emma through the remainder of her pregnancy, and rebuilding aspects of my life that I've neglected in pursuit of corporate success. Your critics might suggest this is simply an elaborate PR strategy, stepping down temporarily while the scandal fades, only to return once public attention has moved on. My critics are free to think what they wish, Maxwell said calmly. Time will demonstrate the truth of my intentions. As the interview concluded, Maxwell felt an unfamiliar lightness. For 30 years, he had carefully constructed and maintained a public persona designed to project power and control. For the first time, he had appeared before millions of viewers as simply himself, uncertain, flawed, and human. The media reaction was predictably mixed. Some outlets praised his candor, while others questioned his sincerity. Financial analysts debated the impact on Sterling Enterprises stock, which initially dropped further before stabilizing as the market absorbed the leadership transition. The conspiracy allegations against Dr. Sheffield and the medical facility in Switzerland sparked a separate investigative frenzy that quickly overshadowed the surrogate story. Through it all, Maxwell remained at the Connecticut property with Emma, ignoring the clamor of the outside world. You didn't have to resign, Emma said one evening as they sat on the property's stone terrace, watching sunset paint the Connecticut hills in amber and gold. Her pregnancy was now visibly evident, her slender form carrying the graceful curve of new life. Yes, I did, Maxwell replied simply. The company was consuming everything, my time, my focus, my identity. I couldn't be the father our son deserves while maintaining that life. You could have taken a leave of absence, as the board suggested. Stepping down completely seemed extreme. Maxwell considered this as he gazed out at the landscape. For 30 years, I've defined myself by what I own, what I control. Buildings, with my name on them. Companies I've acquired. People who follow my directives without question. It took losing almost everything to realize how hollow that definition was. Emma studied him, her green eyes thoughtful. And now? How do you define yourself? I'm still figuring that out, Maxwell admitted. But I know it starts with being worthy of my son's respect and yours. Mine. Emma looked surprised. You've seen me at my worst, calculating, controlling, measuring human value in contractual terms, yet somehow you saw something in me worth challenging, worth expecting better from. Maxwell turned to face her directly. You could have simply fulfilled the contract, taken the money and moved on with your life. Instead, you demanded humanity from me, even when I wasn't offering it. I didn't want our son to have a father who saw him as an acquisition, Emma said softly. Children need to be loved, not possessed. I'm learning the difference, Maxwell replied, slowly. The weeks that followed brought significant changes. Vivian emerged from her silence to file a high-profile lawsuit against Dr. Sheffield and the Swiss medical facility, bringing renewed attention to the corporate conspiracy that had destroyed their marriage. The FBI opened an investigation into the allegations, following money trails that implicated executives at competing medical technology firms. Maxwell, for his part, maintained his distance from the corporate world. He spent his days preparing for his son's arrival, reading parenting books, consulting with child development experts, and converting part of the Connecticut house into a nursery. To Emma's amusement, he approached fatherhood preparation with the same thoroughness he had once directed toward corporate acquisitions, but with a new humility that acknowledged his inexperience. As Emma entered her third trimester, they settled into an unexpected companionship. Maxwell found himself fascinated by her perspective on everything, from literature to scientific research to social policy. She challenged his assumptions without confrontation, expanding his worldview through simple conversation. "Have you thought more about names?" Emma asked one snowy December evening as they sat in the library. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting warm light across the room. "I've been considering William, as I mentioned before," Maxwell replied, "after my grandfather." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "It's a good name. Strong, traditional." "But," Maxwell could hear the hesitation in her voice, "but I wondered if you might consider something that represents a new beginning, rather than looking backward. A name that's uniquely his, not connected to the sterling legacy you've been trying to escape." Maxwell considered this. "What did you have in mind?" "I've always liked the name Ethan," Emma said. "It means strong or enduring, but without the weight of dynastic expectations." Ethan Sterling. Maxwell tested the name. "It has a good sound." "It does," Emma agreed. "A name for someone who can create his own path." "Ethan William Sterling, perhaps," Maxwell suggested. "Honoring the past, but not bound by it." Emma smiled, the firelight catching the auburn highlights in her hair. "I like that very much." The moment stretched between them, comfortable and warm. Maxwell found himself studying her face, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the gentle curve of her smile, the strength evident in her every expression. Something had been building between them for months now, something neither of them had acknowledged directly. "Emma," he began, uncertain how to express what he was feeling. She met his gaze. "Yes? When this is over, when Ethan is born and the contract fulfilled, what will you do?" "Finish medical school as planned," she replied. "The trust fund you established for my mother ensures her care regardless, so I can focus on my education." "And us? What happens to us?" Emma's expression softened. "That depends on what you want, Maxwell. The contract doesn't dictate our future beyond Ethan's birth. What if I want you in my life, in our son's life?" The question emerged more vulnerable than Maxwell had intended. Not as a surrogate or co-parent, but as what? Emma prompted gently when he hesitated. Maxwell Sterling, who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, found himself struggling for words. "As the remarkable woman who changed everything I thought I knew about what matters, as someone I've grown to, care for deeply." Emma reached across the space between them and took his hand. "I think we have time to figure out exactly what that means. For now, it's enough to know we both want to try." In early February, Ethan William Sterling was born during a snowstorm that blanketed the Connecticut countryside in pristine white. He arrived with a strong cry and alert blue eyes, tiny fingers grasping reflexively at the new world around him. As Maxwell held his son for the first time, the weight of this small life in his arms shattered the last remnants of the emotional walls he had built over a lifetime. "He's perfect," Maxwell whispered, tears tracking unashamedly down his face. Emma, exhausted but radiant, watched them together. "He looks like you around the eyes." "Poor child," Maxwell joked, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know," Emma said softly. "I've grown rather fond of those eyes." 3 months later, as spring transformed the Connecticut landscape, Maxwell sat on the terrace with Ethan sleeping peacefully against his chest. The media frenzy had largely subsided. Dr. Sheffield and 3 executives from rival companies had been indicted on multiple federal charges. Sterling Enterprises continued, under new leadership, its stock price recovering as the market adjusted to the transition. Maxwell heard the terrace door open behind him and turned to see Emma emerge from the house. She had recovered fully from the birth. Her natural grace returned, her eyes bright with the intellectual curiosity that had first captured his attention. "Acceptance letter?" he asked, noting the envelope in her hand. Emma nodded, her smile radiant. "Harvard Medical School, full admission for the fall semester." "Congratulations," Maxwell said warmly. "Though I'm not surprised, they'd be fools not to accept you." Emma sat beside him, gently touching Ethan's downy head as he slept. "It means decisions for all of us. Boston is—" "We'll make it work," Maxwell said simply. "I've purchased a house near the medical campus. Modern, but with a garden you'll like. Plenty of room for the three of us, if that's what you want." "Are you asking me to move in with you, Maxwell Sterling?" Emma's eyes held a teasing light. "I'm asking for far more than that," Maxwell replied seriously. "I'm asking if you might consider building a life with me. A real one, not defined by contracts or transactions, or even our son, though he's certainly a powerful bond between us." "Are you proposing?" Emma asked, her expression softening. "Inelegantly, perhaps." Maxwell shifted Ethan gently to one arm, reaching for Emma's hand with his free one. "I've learned that the most valuable things in life can't be bought or controlled or mandated through legal documents. They can only be given freely." "Like love," Emma said softly. "Like love," Maxwell agreed, "which I never expected to find, yet somehow did, through an arrangement that began as anything but romantic." Emma's fingers tightened around his. "Life rarely follows the paths we plan." "Thank God for that," Maxwell said with feeling, looking down at their sleeping son, then back at the extraordinary woman beside him. "So, Emma Thorne, brilliant future doctor and mother of my child, would you do me the honor of joining your life with mine, officially and permanently?" Emma leaned forward and kissed him gently. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Some contracts are worth signing for a lifetime." As the spring breeze carried the scent of new blossoms across the terrace, Maxwell Sterling, once defined solely by his empire, found himself redefined by the simpler, deeper treasures he had never thought to seek: the perfect weight of his son in his arms, and the love of a woman who had seen the human being behind the billionaire's mask. His true legacy, it turned out, had nothing to do with buildings or bank accounts or corporate acquisitions. It lived in the connections that couldn't be bought at any price, only earned through vulnerability, honesty, and the courage to choose love over power. And that, Maxwell realized as he held his family close, was a legacy worth everything he had once thought important, and everything he had never known to value until now. Fimda Historia. Dear listeners, we hope you've been moved by Maxwell and Emma's journey, a powerful reminder that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the connections we build and the love we choose to embrace. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you unique narratives that explore life's complexity and the redemptive power of human connection. Don't miss our upcoming content, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What would you risk for a chance at true happiness?